Hello and welcome to another cybersecurity podcast. I'm here with Adam Couch, principal consultant and all-round cybersecurity expert. Hi, Adam.
Yes, good to be back in the booth.
Yeah, good to have you. So we're talking about the different stages of a pen test.
Indeed.
Before we start, can you just give us a summary of what we mean by penetration test?
Yeah. So I guess what we're doing as professionals, as pen testers, we are looking to find vulnerabilities within a thing, within an entity.
Okay.
So whatever that might be from a client or from a scope.
Yeah.
And it's almost it's the process of enumeration, digging into that thing and finding what is the potential risk for an organisation.
Okay. So it's a fairly structured approach, isn't it?
Indeed.
Yeah. And there's a framework around it.
Yeah.
And you define the scope, and then you look for security weaknesses.
Yeah, and there's lots of formal methodologies and whatnot. What we're going to talk about today is really sort of back to basics a little bit and just walking through kind of the stages that we'd typically go through for penetration test.
Let's do it. So, what's the first stage then?
Yeah, so it all starts with pre-engagement
Okay.
and scoping. So this really sets the groundwork for the test moving forward. So if you almost imagine everybody needs to be aligned about what we're testing, what is that scope? Is that going to be a single system within an internal network? That might be like a single server, or is that like cloud infrastructure?
Yeah.
But almost understanding what we're going to test is absolutely key. So there's obviously no point getting to the end where we've tested something different to what somebody else wants. So just getting everybody aligned in terms of what that scope is.
Right.
And going through some of that pre-engagement. So there might be some prerequisites that we need to discuss with the client and things like that.
So how do you know, or how do you decide what the scope is? I mean, is it a collaborative approach with yourself and the client? Or?
Yeah, so it's a great question. So it all very much depends. So if somebody comes to us and say, we know we want some testing and we're not too sure, this is what we want to test, this is a new thing that we've got, and we can work with somebody to say, okay, well, how does that look like? Where are those data flows in terms of data coming in and out, and what might the potential be there for testing?
Okay. And I guess it's important to understand that, because you can translate that scope into time required to do the test.
Yeah, exactly that. And the reality of it is we need to understand how big it is in order to quantify some time against it. Unfortunately, that's sort of the...
So if the client doesn't know, so let's take a scenario. The client understands the need for a penetration test.
Yes.
Because it's good practice, isn't it?
Yep.
To understand where your security weaknesses are, if any.
Yep.
But so the client comes to you and says, we need to do this. We've got infrastructure, we've got cloud, we've got devices. What do you do? Do you then work with the client? Do you scan the environment, or
in that pre-engagement? We'd look to then start to have those conversations around, okay, what does that actually look like? So you've got a bit of cloud there, and you've got something there. We just walk through essentially what that actually looks like. So is that like a SaaS service within Azure, or is that like a virtual machine, for example, and is it a product that's sat on there as a web service, or how does that actually look? What have you actually got going on? What's configured? And then what are those? And again, sort of thinking about those data flows and entry points. So we effectively go through.
And I guess it helps if the client's got a up-to-date documentation.
Yeah, absolutely. So any extra sort of documentation, high-level design documents are always going to be really useful.
Yeah.
I think it's probably also worth saying sort of that pre-engagement, like getting obviously that signed authorization. Obviously, so us as pen testers, that's super key, and we're always sort of going on about getting that appropriate authorization to test that service. There's nothing worse than obviously being in a situation where we've either got a wrong IP address, etc. We're all that ironed out in that scoping.
And I know you guys use a information gathering form, I think you call it.
Yeah. So again, we typically use that, and again, it just really just depends if somebody knows what they want to put down on that information gathering form in terms of what they know they've got. Or sometimes, to be honest with you, it's just easy with a conversation with somebody. Just jump on a call and discuss something.
Right. So
translate that into like an authorization document, so it's fully documented about how that test's going to happen.
So you've got the scope. The client's happy with the scope.
Yeah.
What happens next?
So we move on. So once we're everything's sort of set up, and it's probably almost worth saying, if you imagine like a timeline in terms of how this would sort of unfold, if you like, you almost got that sort of pre-engagement where you're talking to the client, you're setting up that scope and whatnot. I guess there's probably a point between then and when we actually start the test where we might have several other calls in terms of sort of setup and getting us ready to be in a position where we need to test, so
Okay.
like planning calls and things like
Right,
that.
right.
So at the point when we actually come to start then testing, we're actually all ready to go. We're in a position, say it's an internal assessment, so we're moving on. That very first stage is that reconnaissance then.
Okay.
So we're looking at what we've got, what we're actually looking at, whether that's internal or external,
Okay.
and we're breaking that down into whether that might be passive
Right.
or active recon, but we're really looking to understand what it is we're actually looking
Right.
at and starting to get that sort
So
of
you're almost
nailed
verifying scope, aren't you? Here, you sort of.
in a sense, yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay,
So
good.
we're looking at those at a very high level at that point.
So what happens when, or if you're carrying out the activity and you find systems or devices which weren't on the scope, what happens then?
So we'd have another conversation. So it very much probably depends on where we are and what type of test it is. But
Right.
typically, if there's a kind of a mismatch almost in terms of the scope, then we'd go back to the client essentially,
Okay.
have another conversation, say, look, we've identified this, and this,
Yeah.
or we've come across this, or is this correct,
Yeah. Yeah.
etc. So yeah, it
So-
always gets ironed out.
Does that happen? Do you find stuff that's missed or the client's not
So
aware?
mismatches in terms of for external. So you can quite easily imagine IPs change with
Yeah.
services for external services and things like that.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't happen very often,
Okay.
to be honest. But whenever something like that has happened, it's always just. And again, having that point of contact with the client.
Yeah.
And again, going back to our pre-engagement state, all
Yeah,
of those
yeah.
sorts of details.
It's all collaborative, isn't it? All through this, you're in touch with the client. Yeah. Okay. Good. So you've done your reconnaissance, and then next stage.
Yeah, so we've found out about what we're looking at.
Yeah.
So then we're diving in a little bit deeper at that point, and we're
Okay.
going through our enumeration phase.
Right.
So essentially, this is all about finding out what kind of services we've got on
Okay.
those. So say we've got some IP addresses for an
Yeah.
external assessment. We really want to understand what what services might
Right.
be exposed there.
Okay.
And I think what's really key then is to really understand, okay, well, is it actually a web service or is it
Yeah,
actually
yeah.
an X, Y, or Z?
Yeah.
If we've got some odd ports for an internal assessment,
Yeah.
what is on those odd ports?
Okay.
Is it actually a web server? Or,
Right.
So really understanding and
How
fingerprinting.
do you do this? Are you running a tool or are you
Yeah, so
scanning
there's
tool?
all sorts of tools that we
Right,
can use.
okay.
Won't necessarily get into all of those, but something as simple as like Nmap, which is
Right,
a
yeah,
typical
yeah.
scanning type tool, which
Yeah.
we can basically fingerprint that service.
Okay.
We're really looking for an indicator that this is a X, Y, or Z,
Okay.
essentially.
Okay. So you've got a good view after this activity
Yep.
of what's there
Yep.
against the scope, and what services are live, what services are not live,
Yep.
and so on. You've almost mapped out at this stage. You could, if you wanted to, pretty much draw a network diagram, couldn't you? Because you know.
Yeah, so we've got several hosts, for example,
Yeah,
like
yeah.
if it's on the inside or the outside, and we've mapped across in that enumeration. We've mapped those services to those IP addresses, and we found things like, okay, it's a web service,
Yeah.
and it's running this version, for example, or
Right.
it's an X, Y, or Z, an
Yeah.
FTP server, and it's running this service,
Yeah.
or it's. So we've got some of that information essentially.
Yeah.
We've verified some
Okay.
of that, and we can see it.
So, if you are running a web app test,
Yep.
does this still apply?
It does very
Yeah.
much so, but we're probably thinking about it in a different sense. This is probably more from I'm probably thinking of it more
More for
from
infrastructure.
an infrastructure perspective at this
yeah.
point in time.
So, if it's a web app, you'd be looking at number of pages and
Yeah, absolutely. So
authentication
different
and so on.
attributes on a web page, for
Yeah.
example, user input and things like that. The guys would very much be starting to map out
Yeah.
that site.
Okay. Right. So you're on to stage 4 then.
Yeah, so the vulnerability analysis stage
Okay.
at this point. So we've got those services and we've got some of those version numbers and
Yeah.
we've identified and we've validated that those things are actually what they say they are.
Mm-hmm.
And now we're looking at it from okay, well, we know what it is. We know
Yeah.
it's a HTTP. We know it's a web server. What version is it?
Okay.
Can we therefore take advantage of it?
Right.
And what is the potential there?
Okay. So this is where you're actually looking for weaknesses.
This is where we're looking for weaknesses, and we're almost saying, okay, well, it's an outdated version of an X, Y, or Z,
Yeah.
and we might be able to apply this vulnerability to
Okay.
it, or we might be able to be crafting our own
Right.
thing,
Okay.
whatever it is, essentially.
So-
it's all about we've identified it in the enumeration, and
Right.
we're now applying either a known vulnerability or taking advantage of our own.
I just want to ask you then. So you've seen that it's out of date,
Yes.
and you said you'll apply. You see if you can exploit a vulnerability.
Yeah.
How do you know which vulnerabilities exist?
So there's lots of different sources essentially out on the internet. So there's
Okay.
like the like National Vulnerability Database, for example,
Right.
list of CVEs.
Mm-hmm.
And we can use those effectively.
Okay.
So we'd be searching effectively for a version
Right.
of that service to
Yeah.
see whether there's any vulnerabilities.
Okay.
There's all sorts of like search exploit.
And this is what attackers would do, wouldn't they?
Yeah, pretty much.
Which is why we always say make sure your patching is up to date, and you're using up to date
Absolutely.
operating systems and so on. Okay.
Yeah.
So you've done your vulnerability analysis.
Yes.
So are you documenting anything at this stage, or are you?
Yeah, obviously. Yeah. So sorry, well, obviously, but we're constantly
Yeah.
documenting
Right.
it as
Okay.
we go. It probably seems more obvious to me.
Well,
yeah, we'd be documenting it
Yeah,
as we go. So
yeah.
right through from the initial,
Right.
very early stages, all that enumeration that
Yeah.
we've done, we're constantly documenting. And
And that's really key, isn't it? Because at the end of all of this, there's going to be a report.
yes,
The
absolutely.
important part of this is that you're physically writing the report, aren't you? That you're not sort of spewing the report out through an
Yeah.
automated tool.
Yeah, and again, very much depending on the approach that might be taken. So
Yeah.
again, we might do some vulnerability scanning within that
Yeah,
penetration
yeah.
test. It's just another tool in the tool bag.
course.
We can use some of that
Right.
data to inform us of some of those vulnerabilities. And again, but if it's a very much a manual penetration test, and we're using like less automated tools, for example, then we're going to be documenting. Now there's lots of different tools that will give us lots of different output and things like that, and we'll essentially use that.
You'll use your experience and knowledge then to
Yeah.
interpret the output of those tools
Absolutely.
and then document. Okay, that's good. So that's the vulnerability analysis,
Yeah.
and then I was going to call this the fun bit, but I suppose.
Oh yeah. So it's,
The
I mean,
next
it's all
stage.
fun, but this. Yeah, a lot of the guys will see this as kind of being that
Right.
next stage, and this is where people really start to really enjoy like the penetration. And people obviously. So we're talking about the exploitation.
But this is the
phase, right?
exploitation
So-
stage. Yeah.
And people talk about getting shells and things like
Yeah,
that, and
yeah.
like new testers, and
Yeah,
and,
I see a lot of excitement when I
Yeah,
see you guys do
totally,
this.
Totally, yeah. So this is where we're taking what we've identified in the enumeration phase and then
Right.
the vulnerability
Yeah.
analysis phase. We know there's a known vulnerability. Can we then use this to do the do and
Can you get into the
exploit that
environment?
service
Yeah.
essentially? And again, that might look different with different services.
Yeah.
But can we effectively fully take advantage of it
Yeah,
and
yeah.
improve? And is it repeatable?
Yeah.
Again, all the documentation for
Absolutely.
that repeatable sort of side of things. So that's where we're
Okay.
using either that exploit that we've got or crafting our own
Yeah.
to take advantage of that service.
So how realistic is this? And I know we've got a separate podcast on red teaming, which is it's a fairly realistic emulation of an attack.
Yep,
How realistic is this?
it's pretty realistic
Is
at
it?
the end
Okay.
because what we're doing, and this is one of the reasons why we do this, isn't it? So it's essentially to prove and show
Yeah.
to the organisation, look, there's a risk here.
Yeah,
There's a thing here,
Yeah.
and we've been able to do it.
Right.
And by documenting that and showing people, that's
Yeah.
so this
So
is
you-
realistic.
So you're showing that this can be exploited by an attacker,
Yes.
but it's better that you do it rather than the attacker does
So
it. Because
I suppose there's probably another debate about how realistic is it in terms of like the realism, in terms of would this actually happen, or
Right, yeah.
versus can it actually be done. So
Yeah.
there's a can it be done in terms of we've done it and here's a screenshot to say
Yeah.
we've done it.
Yeah.
There's another probably argument to say, well, how realistic is it? Like in realism,
Yeah,
in
yeah.
terms of would an attacker be able to do it now? Where we talk about like things like red teaming, that's really showing that realistic approach. That's emulating those.
It's a very
attack
different
vectors.
approach, though, isn't it?
Yeah,
So here, I mean, you mentioned we talked in the beginning that this is a structured approach, and that's key, isn't it? Because
Yeah.
with a pen test, they know that we're testing.
yep,
They've helped define the scope.
Yeah.
They've. I was going to say assumed breach, but is that fair to say? Is it an assumed breach or?
yeah. So there could be, and it very much. So when we think about when we're scoping tests like this, yes, we could do an assumed breach, and it could be categorized as that.
Yeah.
We do assumed breaches tests within a red team assessment to simulate like a rogue employee,
Right,
something
okay.
like that, for example.
Okay.
Yeah,
So this is you've now identified whether or not you can exploit a particular vulnerability.
Yes.
And you go through all of your everything that you've found.
Yep.
And some of them you might be able to exploit, some you may not be able to
Yep.
exploit, and then you categorize them in terms of impact to the client, the risk.
So we'd obviously go through that, and it's probably, we'd obviously have in our minds at this point how severe or what the risk level essentially is, how we're going to categorize that. We'll already have a pretty good idea if it's a public CV or a public exploit.
Right. Okay.
We'll probably know how bad this exploit is, and again, it probably just depends on. We talk about things like getting shells and getting like remote command injection or something like that, or obviously that's going to dictate and how we've exploited and what we can do with it in terms of the different severity ratio. Now, when we're talking on like the sort of the top end of that, like the real risky stuff, then obviously we're going to have another conversation with the client, keeping that comms up and saying, look, there's this. But again, if we've almost run some vulnerability scans potentially with there might be a whole pile of stuff. We'll use our expertise and knowledge to let that client know what we need to let them know.
And if you find something which you feel is a high risk or a critical risk, you let the client know straight away, and then if they decide that they can fix it, remediate it while you're there, are you able to retest, or how does that work?
So I'm of the view, in my experience, if I can do it and I've got the time to do it within that assessment, then I'll do it.
Okay.
It's really as simple. It's just really about almost just setting the expectations with the client to say, look, if we've got time and we can do it, that's fine. If we haven't, we're obviously
because you do have, this is a time-bound activity, isn't it? The whole penetration test.
And we're obviously stuck to those times to a degree, and that's what we've got to make sure we get through that test. But look, at the end of the day, if there's time to do it, then
if you can help, you will help.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, that's great. Okay, so that's the exploitation stage, and then you're on to the next stage then.
Yeah, so almost equally as fun. So taking that to the next level, so that's that post-exploitation stage. So what can we actually do now? We've actually done the thing. So we've got to that thing and we've done it. Let's not stop there.
Right.
Let's move on and sort of chain some of those vulnerabilities together.
Oh, right,
what can we do at this point? So potentially vulnerability, like post-exploitation in terms of privilege escalation.
Yeah.
What can we actually do? So taking that to the next level in terms of, can we exfil some of that data, or like in a sort of testing sort of way in terms of to prove that point essentially.
Okay.
Obviously within the realms of the scope.
Of course. And this is where
filling anybody's data,
where your sort of knowledge and experience really comes into play, doesn't it? Because you're chaining different exploits together, and you're working out, where's the valuable stuff that I can potentially gain access to.
Yeah, and again, that might be as part of that penetration test. That might be sort of that goal to do X, Y, or Z. And it might be to try and get to there, or it might be to get to there and then stop. And again, people would, might want us to stop before doing some of that sort of implementations. Equally, there might be full reign to do the do.
So again, with the red team, I mean, this obviously we're talking about pen testing here. But with red teaming, we often say it's a goal-based assessment.
Yes.
So there's a difference, isn't there, between this and the red team exercise?
So we probably should have mentioned that back in the sort of pre-engagement.
We can edit it in, it's fine.
But essentially, it's almost there will be that goal in terms of that penetration test, whether that is to get to X, Y, or Z, or to do this, or to find as many vulnerabilities within that.
Okay.
So it's almost addressing that.
Right. So you've done your post-exploitation. You're into stage 7 now, if you're counting. 7. No. This is the important bit, isn't it?
It is. And this is really like the time to shine, though, isn't it? It's like this is the reporting stage. So this is almost getting what we found, getting it down, and getting it into a digestible format for our clients to be able to do something with it, something actionable that we can take away. So again, have all the usual things that you might expect in a penetration test. So an executive summary. There might be like a list of vulnerabilities. It's sort of halfway through, and then we'll get into like the detailed section. And again, if there has been a walkthrough, almost like a set of stages, if you like, to exploit a service, for example, it might be appropriate to put have a narrative of a walkthrough of how we've done that.
This
which
is how we've done it, and here's some screenshots showing.
So it's like an almost step-by-step approach.
Right. Does that allow the client then to almost do that again or simulate what you've done? Or?
No, not necessarily, but it's just showing like
that you've done it and it's achievable.
It's achievable. These are the steps that we've taken to do this.
Right.
And again, sort of in that narrative, we'll have some recommendations, but all of those steps that we've done that will then be listed in the detailed findings. Right. So we're listing out each stage of that bit of narrative, essentially.
Okay. And then there's a remediation action plan as well, isn't there?
Yeah, so we'd typically have everything in like the report, and then as well as in like an XLSX sheet, effectively. So people can easily work through it. It's far much more digestible in terms of it's easy to work through.
Yeah, they can allocate resources and
open and close issues, put comments against it, allocate it to X, Y, or Z person.
And how do you? I know you mentioned a little bit about CVSS scores, so just touch on that a little bit more. So how do you categorize your findings?
Yeah, so typically a lot of vulnerabilities that are publicly exposed will already have a score, and then we'll use a CVSS-based score essentially to assign those. So version 3, and we'll essentially go through the metrics essentially to build up that score.
Okay, and then they'll get a table or sort of high, medium, low. There's a critical as well, isn't there?
Yeah, so that base score essentially will relate to a severity level, and then that will effectively then go in, and obviously everything then is ordered via severity.
Okay.
So again, breaking that kind of issue down, if you like. So we'd have things like the description, impact, the affected hosts, and then there might be like a screenshot or some technical information about what the detail is around that essentially. Yeah.
And then some recommendations around what they need to do. And that helps the client then to prioritise the remediation action.
Yes. Okay. Yeah. And again, that's mirrored in the remediation action plan. Again, severity order, all of those details are all there.
Okay. So the report's delivered securely.
Yes.
Yeah. Yep. And the client gets a report. And if the client sort of has trouble in interpreting the findings or the report itself, what happens then?
So it's always really a case of just being on the end of the phone or at the end of an email, just to sort of
or a Teams call
or anything like that. It might be part of that engagement to walk through it in any case after the test. But I always sort of say to people, look, the doors are always open. Got any clarifications? I'd much rather somebody come back to me rather than struggle.
And that's the important bit, isn't it? It's not hand the report over and run. It's you're there with the client, making sure they understand what they need to do.
It's nothing just to reply back to an email to say or to clarify something as appropriate. Yeah.
Right, I think we're on to the final stage.
Yeah. So once all that's done and dusted, somebody's done a load of hard work after the back of the report. So the remediation and any retesting. So they've started to remediate those services, or they've already gone through that sort of post that testing, and then it's just essentially retesting, ensuring that is all good.
Okay.
Essentially.
And then do you how does that work? Is often packaged as the pen test where there's a retest element, or is it an option? Or
it very much case by case basis. Right. Okay. Somebody might want to sort of book ahead and sort of say, as part of this penetration test, we want to go ahead and do that. Yeah. We know we're probably going to need to do some retesting afterwards because we need to get to X, Y, or Z level. Right. So we'll just put that in now. Yeah. Or it might be a case that somebody needs to go away and, blimey, I didn't realise I'd got that much stuff going on. I need to, it's going to take us a couple of months or whatever. That might be something further down the line. Okay. But again, when we're doing retesting, it's probably really important that we just articulate and define how that retesting is going to look. Because obviously we think about things like point-in-time assessments. Yeah. Are we testing the issues, or are we retesting the thing as a whole in its entirety?
How do you decide?
Which very much depends on what's somebody might want us to just specifically look at this.
Just look at the highs or the criticals or so on.
Issue, or somebody might want to say, right, okay, it's actually been sort of 6 months or so. We need to do the thing again. Yeah.
Okay. Final thoughts, then, Adam.
Yeah.
That's a really good description of a pen test, all the different stages. So, in terms of final thoughts, then. So we've touched on Red Team, and there's a different podcast on which you were here doing that.
Yep.
So pen testing is really important to as part of a cybersecurity strategy.
Yep.
Red Team sort of sits kind of above that. We're not saying it's a replacement for a pen test,
No.
it's both.
Yep.
So how often would you advise that a client should do a penetration test?
That's a good question. So really,
Or minimum,
yeah. So there's obviously people would be mandated by different different elements in terms of like a whatever they're mandated by. But essentially, if a piece of architecture changes, for example, then they might want further assurance around how it's configured or what vulnerabilities, what risks are there.
Yeah.
If somebody's going through like on a yearly IT health check, that might be appropriate in terms of a bigger assessment.
Right.
It might be appropriate to put penetration testing in there. It might be more appropriate, again, depending on how much assurance somebody wants of a network, to then carry that out maybe quarterly.
Okay.
And again, if we split those, we've just mentioned sort of red teaming, penetration testing. We probably hadn't necessarily, we touched on scanning and vulnerability assessments.
Yeah.
But if we think about that in kind of almost that tiered approach, VA, pen testing, and you might want to do vulnerability assessment more often as a sort of sweeping the network and finding some of those sort of more high level vulnerabilities, sort of patching and things like that.
Okay.
And then penetration testing obviously is going to be taking advantage of some of those and linking and chaining some of those exploits together. And then obviously we've got that red team assessment. It very much depends on how much assurance somebody wants and what they're probably mandated by in terms
what the
of
risks are.
What the risks are.
And what sort of in what sector they're in as well, isn't it? I mean,
very much so.
So certain sectors are
things like that
kind of mandated anyway. Yeah. Excellent. Thank you, Adam.
All righty.
And thank you for listening. Don't forget to like and subscribe and give us some comments and feedback on anything else you want us to talk about in future podcasts. And that's all for now. See you on the next one.
Thank you for listening to our cybersecurity podcast. If you're keen to learn more, please visit our website www.aristi.co.uk. Cybersecurity made simple.